Of the 7 seasons where Tom Baker portrayed the Doctor, his 4th, season 15, is arguably the one which receives the least attention or love. And I'm not gonna pretend like I don't see why. As a run of 6 serials that came out during a rough transitional period between 2 creative perspectives with drastically different tonal attitudes, its flaws as a result of these circumstances are certainly hard to ignore. And yet, I confess I do feel some twisted form of affection for it. It may be a mess, but I'm endlessly fascinated by season 15. So buckle up, as I take you through an analysis of one of the 4th Doctor's less popular seasons. So in order to set the stage for why season 15 is the way that it is, first I shall explore the circumstances of its creation. Philip Hinchcliffe, who had overseen production of Tom Baker's first 3 seasons as the 4th Doctor, is widely admired in fandom for the creative vision that he demonstrated during his tenure. Together with script editor Robert Holmes, the duo took Doctor Who through the lens of uncompromising darkness and gothic horror influences, and as a result they would birth some of the show's, nay, the franchise's most celebrated and beloved entries via the commission of about half a dozen other writers. Terry Nation's Genesis of the Daleks, Robert Banks Stewart's Terror of the Zygons and the Seeds of Doom, Chris Boucher's The Robots of Death, and even Holmes himself getting in on penning a few entries with The Ark in Space, The Deadly Assassin, The Talons of Weng Chiang, and heavily rewriting Pyramids of Mars from someone else's demo script. However, when you're writing such unfriendly material for what is meant to be Saturday tea time entertainment for the whole family in the mid-1970s, some monocles are going to pop. Doctor Who had already long been a hot-button issue in the appropriate for children discussion for years by this point, and it would still go on to be brought up in this discourse for decades to come. But Hinchcliffe's tenure as producer was arguably where these concerns reached their peak, with numerous print outlets weighing in on the topic of the show's violence and whether or not it was suitable for the younger viewers. And most infamously, leading the charge against Doctor Who was founder of the National Viewers and Listeners Association, hardcore Christian activist and future Margaret Thatcher simp Mary Whitehouse. In response to this outcry, the BBC were already planning on replacing Hinchcliffe as producer to tone down the violence, but when the cliffhanger to The Deadly Assassin Part 3 showcased the Doctor's head being held firmly underwater and freeze-framed on his apparent watery demise, well, that really was the icing on the cake. Something the week-long images in a child's mind. So off Hinchcliffe went, and in came his replacement for the producer role, a chap by the name of Graham Williams, who was under strict orders by head of serials Graham MacDonald to tone down the show's darker elements and make it more family-friendly. So in short, the BBC wanted to appease the Bible thumpers and the gee-whiz parents out there by turning Doctor Who into a less antagonistic show for its Saturday primetime slot. How would they go about doing that, and what were the results? Well, it's interesting. To fill the void left by the reduction of horror and violence, new producer Graham Williams was very enthusiastic to incorporate more sophisticated wit in particular to compensate, with his main course of action being to lean into his leading man's manic charisma. This humour-focused approach would score some success in the long run, most notably when Williams nabbed the Douglas Adams to be a writer and the eventual script editor for the following seasons 16 and 17 respectively. But it's right at Williams' debut where we run into our first problem, because he had inherited Hinchcliffe's script editor Robert Holmes, among other writers from that same creative pool. Now, I don't mean to suggest that Holmes and company could only do horror. That's absolutely far from the case and would be a ludicrous suggestion. But it must be noted that Holmes was no stranger stranger to this kind of controversy, and he seemed to strongly disagree with the notion that Doctor Who needed to be kidified. Holmes would go on to script edit the first 3 serials of season 15 before promptly leaving his position. Graham, both Williams and MacDonald, apparently kept a watchful eye on his work during this time to ensure that things didn't go overboard, and yet, ironically, I don't think they were particularly effective, because judging from the final results, it feels like Holmes stuck to his guns regardless. Respect to the man, but when you're a script editor who believes Doctor Who should be written as a horror, and you're now working under a producer who thinks Doctor Who should be less horrific, surely that's a conflict of interest there. Holmes also personally wrote the 4th serial of the season himself, but his former position was now helmed by Anthony Reid, who, like Williams, was also an advocate for lightening up Doctor Who's tone, a sensibility he applied to the remaining stories of the run. So it took until halfway through Williams' first season as producer for the creative process of the show to truly get in line with the mood that he and the BBC aspired for. Better late than never, I guess? However, while things were starting to tonally line up, another issue was beginning to rear its pricey head. We'll go more in depth about that later. Either way, as a result of these behind-the-scenes shifts, Season 15 ends up having a very disjointed overall mood. And when you take a step back and look at all 6 stories that comprise it, it doesn't feel particularly cohesive as a season of television. Predictably, 2 of the scripts that Holmes oversaw, Terrance Dicks's Horror of Fang Rock and Chris Boucher's Image of the Fendal, pretty much feel like honorary Hinchcliffe-era outings. In fact, I dare say, at points, they're tonally darker than the majority of the previous 3 seasons. Horror of Fang Rock is a claustrophobic body snatcher set in an isolated lighthouse on a foggy night, which literally has all the supporting characters die by the conclusion. Image of the Fendal, meanwhile, features occult, borderline satanic rituals and giant alien slugs that are the embodiment of death itself. Not to mention a particularly macabre moment where the Doctor gives an incurably possessed man a gun to end his own torment with. That's pretty metal. I wonder how Mrs. Whitehouse felt about that. Meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, Holmes' self-written script The Sunmakers, penned firmly under Williams and Reid's creative vision, is an upbeat satirical commentary on high tax rates and the state of capitalism, complete with quirky supporting characters and a dorky snivelling villain who gets defeated by a loss of profits and a champagne cork. Oh, and bear in mind that Image of the Fendal and The Sunmakers were broadcast back-to-back in the season lineup. It's not like this was a gradual change built up to, it literally just happens on a dime. Yeah, that's a bit of a jump. And that's not to mention Bob Baker and Dave Martin's The Invisible Enemy, which, despite being script edited by Holmes, feels caught between these 2 creative directions, and as a result it ends up with a rather confused tone in and of itself. There's a sentient parasitic virus storyline going on, with aspects of psychological horror threaded in, and the fact that the Doctor is afflicted feels like an attempt to raise the tension. And yet it's also the one that introduces one of Doctor Who's most inherently quirky, gimmicky companions, and prominently features a hospital location with over-the-top goofball characters and phonetically misspelt signs. Yeah, I don't know what tone it's going for, to be honest. The thing is, though, a disjointed tone wouldn't necessarily sink this ship. I mean, Season 15 wasn't the first batch of serials in the show's history to be extremely varied in that department. Season 3 was similarly the victim of behind-the-scenes turmoil, itself also struggling to navigate a hectic producer changeover, and as a result it also has a lot of storytelling discrepancy, and yet it's also nowhere near as extreme, or at least certainly not from my point of view. And I think a big reason for that is, while both seasons 3 and 15 vary a lot in tone, season 15 varies much, much more in quality. Season 15 might be one of the most divisive runs of serials in the entire show, with the gulf between the highs and the lows being as vast as the Grand Canyon. The season opener, Horror of Fang Rock, is widely regarded as one of the best Fourth Doctor stories, having consistently broken into the top 10 Tom Baker outings across multiple DWM polls, and often being mentioned as one of the standouts of the Williams era. Image of the Fendal also receives a fair amount of appreciation, albeit nowhere near to the same degree. Meanwhile, the Sunmakers and the Invisible Enemy certainly have their fans, but have often ended up in the more middling to lower tiers of serials in numerous fan polls over the years. And as for Underworld and the Invasion of Time, oh sweaty, you're gonna be hard pressed to find a double whammy of back-to-back classic stories as aggressively disliked as those two. Time Flight and Arc of Infinity, The Power of Kroll and the Armageddon Factor, The Ultimate Foe and Time and the Rani? I don't think any of those combinations even come close. In the eyes of fan consensus, this season is absolutely all over the place when it comes to actual quality writing, and full disclosure here, I do agree. Horror of Fang Rock is one of my favourite Doctor Who stories of all time, with a perfect blend of slow burn creeping claustrophobic dread, absolutely biting satire in regards to the corruption of the wealthy, and razor sharp character work for everyone involved. One of my immediate recommendations for spooky Doctor Who, and, anecdotally, also one of the first stories I showed to my partner who, full disclosure, hated Doctor Who before meeting me and is now fine with it, so take that how you will. 'Cause every time we touch, I get this feeling. Meanwhile, as for the Invasion of Time, I'm gonna make a bold claim. I think this is the first truly bad Doctor Who story. I know, some of you may ask, what about the story just before it? Or what about the space pirates? And yeah, I'll admit, I'm not keen on either of those two serials. But the biggest criticisms levelled against them either stem from issues outside of the actual narrative, like the jaw-droppingly bad production values in Underworld's case, or the lacking archival placeholder presentation with the space pirates, or are based on more surface-level entertainment value rather than actual critical analysis, hence why they are often labelled as dull or boring above anything else. That's not to say those stories don't have massive gaping problems, of course, but their real infamy seems to stem from issues outside of the core text. The Invasion of Time, though, is just fundamentally dreadful in every core storytelling aspect, from its contrived and badly established setup, to its mishandling of our lead characters, to its absolute rambling, incoherent mess of a narrative. And it's a shame because it does show promise. A grand invasion of Gallifrey, the Doctor claiming the presidency and behaving shady, putting his friendship with his alienated companion to the test. These are all story beats ripe with potential, and yet the writing just completely drops the ball. The rest of the season I'm split on. I've discussed Image of the Fendal in one of my earliest videos, but I dig its small-town cultist tone and the premise of scientists uncovering an unfathomable Lovecraftian horror. The plotting is a little cloudy, but by design, really creating an unsettling experience that suits such a thematically existential threat. It's also got some vivid character work, about on par with Horror of Fang Rock. The Sunmakers is also up there. An upbeat but brutal commentary on taxation, complete with great action set pieces, and a rebellious cynicism just playful enough to hit that desired tone Williams was yearning for. However, I confess I've never been that keen on the Invisible Enemy. It's certainly got creativity in spades. Miniature clones of Four and Leela venturing inside the Doctor's brain to defeat a parasitic infection is absolutely inspired, but I've always found its pacing to be very unrefined and its character work rather shallow and mediocre. And Underworld, I mean, it sucks, although I think it can make for a fun experience in the company of others. But ultimately, yes, Season 15 is not only tonally disparate, but in terms of actual quality, it's all over the map. And the cause of that is harder to discern or pin down on any behind-the-scenes activities. I mean, I do think Bob Baker and Dave Martin as a duo are among Classic Who's weaker and more inconsistent recurring writers, and having them pen not one, but 2 serials in the same season does demonstrate this. But then you've got The Sunmakers, a script by beloved Classic Who god Robert Holmes that curiously isn't universally beloved, and this ain't even Troughton or Colin era Holmes either, where the L's just kept coming. This is Holmes literally fresh off his peak popularity as script editor, so this dip is curious. And as for The Invasion of Time, well, allegedly it was penned in 2 weeks by Williams himself and script editor Anthony Reed as a last-minute replacement for another cancelled serial idea, and boasted countless production issues. But it certainly wouldn't be the first or last story to suffer from such issues, and there have been scripts written in far shorter timeframes that have turned out amazingly, one of which literally opens this very season, and another of which came out 2 seasons later and just so happens to share the same pseudonymic pen name, so I don't know if I can confidently claim those factors in particular are what doomed the story. I guess some writers just work better on a time limit than others. Though since I mentioned production issues, I might as well acknowledge the elephant in the room. This season had, like, no money. Not only had Hinchcliffe's final season overspent, making one of Williams' priorities be to save as much money as possible, but also inflation was on the rise in the UK, a fact that directly inspired The Sunmakers in the first place, and it also served as a pretty major blow to the programme's budget. By the 4th serial of the season, they were clearly already on the thinnest, most threadbare shoestring in the world, and it didn't help that many of the talented prop and set designers of the Hinchcliffe years had moved on by this point too. And so, in what has retrospectively got to be one of the most infamous creative decisions in all of Classic Who, Graham Williams decided that the 5th serial of the season, Underworld, would forego set design for the most part and instead rely on a technique called colour separation overlay, basically a primitive form of green screen, to superimpose the actors onto the necessary environments as a cost-saving measure. Such techniques can struggle to be entirely convincing even nowadays with the most lavish budgets and sturdy corporate backings in the world. The results in 1978, when the BBC had like 3 pence? Not exactly immersive. Classic Who already doesn't exactly have a stellar reputation when it comes to really anything production related, but this proved to be such a spectacular failure that it's literally the first thing anyone ever brings up about Underworld. And that's not exactly promising. After all, we Classic Who fans as a group are pretty much geared to look past bad production for the sake of a good story. And yet, the fact that we immediately think about how outrageously poor this story looks above everything else, yeah, that says a lot. Even Williams himself ended up admitting that this was a pretty failed experiment. The Invasion of Time looks pretty bad too, from its garishly matte plastic Gallifreyan set design, to trying to pass off a dank cellar as a TARDIS corridor multiple times, to, most infamously, the tinfoil Vardens. Yeah, season 15 didn't exactly have Scrooge McDuck reserves to fund its concluding stories, did it? Either way, I think now is a good opportunity to segue into a discussion of how season 15 handles the lead characters in the midst of all this chaos. As I said earlier, Graham Williams took the task of lightening up Doctor Who as an opportunity to inject more comedy into the show, and a very big factor in this decision was the leeway he would give Tom Baker in that department. Now, while the 4th Doctor could already be rather manic and larger than life even during some of his more somber stories, Williams allowed Baker more opportunities to ad-lib and go more off-script whenever possible, taking his Doctor Doctor into a more witty, egotist direction. A decision that would kinda let Tom go a bit mad with power and make him harder to direct and thus work with. Either way, a lot of fans, particularly of the Hinchcliffe era, say that this is the point where the Fourth Doctor's characterization changes for the worse, losing a lot of that contemplative melancholy that they liked in his earliest entries. But to be honest, I'd have to contest that notion somewhat. While, yes, a shift to a more fast-talking cartoon Fourth Doctor does start around here, I wouldn't say it happens too abruptly, and I think there's still plenty of depth to him in this season. I can point to a fair amount of moody, self-reflective moments peppered throughout the run, where his confidence or beliefs are tested and he gets knocked down a peg, just like some of his most defining moments in his earlier serials. Now granted, a lot of that retains sullenness may be thanks to Holmes staying overtime to work on the first 3 stories, as well as personally writing the 4th himself, possibly weaving in some of the character's prior groundedness and making sure the changing tonal approach to the show wasn't too drastic on the character's part right off the bat. And as for the Doctor's comedic side, honestly, I don't think it's really that much of an escalation in this season specifically, either in terms of frequency or intensity. Whatever jokes or slapstick Tom added here, in my opinion, I think was tasteful. It still feels like the same character, just evolving somewhat, and in my humble opinion, not necessarily for the worse. The same thing extends to the inherited Hinchcliffe companion of the season, Leela, who, on paper, you'd think would have suffered a lot from the changeover. After all, Leela was established as a gritty cave woman warrior from an artificially barbaric society, and with the show being forced into a more light-hearted, jovial mold, you'd think her character would be significantly neutered. But that side of her surprisingly isn't shied away from. She is still a savage warrior, adept for violent activities which they aren't afraid to show on screen. Although there are a handful of moments where they create narrative reasons to limit that. And of course she still has that contrasting tenderness and sense of justice that lends her dimension. I mean, this is the season where she sees a guy about to attempt suicide and immediately pleads with him not to jump. Honestly, underrated moment that speaks volumes about who she is. Speaking of underrated, the ending scene to Horror of Fang Rock where her eye colour changes is one of the most compelling Doctor-companion interactions in the entire show, and I don't care if it only exists because of those damn contact lenses. But I digress. With the increase in comedy, her dynamic with the Doctor becomes a lot warmer and more banterous. Sometimes there's jokes at her expense, sometimes there's jokes at his. Most of the time it's just them having a generally great rapport. You'd never be able to tell that Louise Jameson and Tom Baker weren't on good terms. Side note, I've never understood the observation that the Doctor was purposefully trying to civilize Leela, not in this season or the last one. I know that was the intent behind her role, hence the Eliza Doolittle inspiration, but concept and execution are not one in the same. The only aspect of her that he disapproved of was her eagerness to kill, which strikes me as a fairly reasonable irk given the suspicion they can garner on their travels, cause otherwise he really doesn't care at all. Anything else she's taught is something that she clearly actively wants to pursue or learn about on her own terms, and not once does she let any of it change who she is, which is something I've honestly always found to be very inspiring and engaging about her. The only real downside to Leela in this season is her exit. Louise Jameson was ready to move on after having had a pretty hectic time working on the show, but Graham Williams was overly optimistic that he could convince her to stay on for the next season, and so, while writing The Invasion of Time, he refrained from naturalistically planting the seeds for her character to leave and naively hoped the serial would end with her going with the Doctor as per usual. Then when he learned that Louise was committed to exiting the show and had already been cast in an upcoming play, that left the only avenue for Leela's departure to be sudden and abrupt. And because Williams felt that killing her off would be too traumatic for the younger viewers, he decided that she should fall in love with some random Time Lord guard who she barely had any interaction with. You know, this is the same adventure where the Doctor seemingly betrayed her trust to pursue a position of power, as well as also being the one where she interacted with a warrior lifestyle very akin to the environment she grew up in, and both of these factors would have been far more organic foundations to build an ending on, but go off, Graham. What a waste. Well, at least she gets to keep the dog. Sort of. Speaking of which, if you really needed evidence that they wanted to take Doctor Who in a more inviting and family-friendly direction, look no further than the fact that they decided to give the Doctor a pupper. But get this, the sci-fi twist is that he's a robot! K9 was introduced in the second serial of the season, The Invisible Enemy, and started being a regular main character from the fourth onwards after some hasty rewrites. And hey, despite the dozens of behind-the-scenes technical difficulties with the prop barely functioning and Tom Baker hating the character with a furious passion, K9 would go on to be one of Doctor Who's most iconic staples, so he was obviously a hit in that respect, and arguably he was Season 15's biggest contribution to overall Doctor Who lore. Honestly, this and the following Season 16 were easily his peak as a character. They give him this adorably snarky yet eager to please edge that makes him more than just a one-dimensional fact bank. And his dynamic with Leela brings out a cute, nurturing side to her. And that's not to mention the hilarious love-hate relationship he has with the Doctor. What a good woofer. Bow wow wow. So, Season 15 is ultimately kind of a mess. Caught in the moral panic that plagued the Hinchcliffe era, the BBC really wanted Doctor Who to withdraw from the controversy and tone down its darker elements despite the show's popularity. However, in the process of trying to course correct, Season 15 develops tonal whiplash between the former creative direction and the mood the higher-ups wanted it to pursue, and with an increasingly diminishing budget and some sloppy writing sprinkled in, this results in a far more confused and uneven season than its predecessors in the Fourth Doctor era. But that's not to say that it didn't have strengths, because despite the combination of these different factors, Season 15 still did have some solid material, with a few good stories and, on the whole, some great moments for our lead characters. It's certainly a mixed run of adventures, but I don't know, we all love to root for an underperformer, right? Good on you, Season 15. Despite the dozens of setbacks and production hiccups, you still did decently. Still not forgiving the Invasion of Time, though.